I would like to give a keynote talk on the search for a pure rule set in EU4. So I'd like to begin by motivating that, in general, human knowledge progresses through communication and interaction. And in EU4, our gameplay knowledge progresses through what I consider comparison. Here's what I mean. Let's take world conquest as the objective. You might have various world conquests done in various patches with various rule sets. We can try to unify certain variables. For example, we can unify by starting nation. I can say, let's look at all the world conquests that begin with the nation A, and then try to search through all world conquests that are done, and try to understand something from them, try to learn something from them. The problem is that versions might be different, and that's unfortunately unavoidable in my opinion. And moreover, the kind of rule sets that people use are very different. And also, they're often not very well communicated. So the central question is, how can we compare different runs in EU4, and what can we learn from each run? So in practice, I think there's a sort of conservative approach that people do, which is that they do not compare runs at all. They say, well, the rule sets we use are different, therefore it's not so obvious how one can extract any kind of findings from this run that superficially seems similar, but is very different just because of the kind of things that they do that I don't personally do, or vice versa, the kind of things that they don't do but I allow. The most radical presentation of this is the so-called no exploit approach, where you essentially call every run that you don't do an exploit, and everything you do as the only way to play the game. And then essentially give you some kind of mental comfort in and justification for not doing any kinds of comparisons. The other approach that I'd like to believe that I was able to propagate and sort of popularize is this so-called laundry list approach. And the idea with the laundry list approach is that in every report of a run, an EU4 run, you just list all the things that you disallow, and maybe all the things that you allow that you think are typically assumed to be disallowed. For example, I might state that my run used a lot of save scums. On the other hand, I might not list that my run used some reasonable save scums, because it seems like within the community it's like a general expectation that you are allowed to do reasonable save scums for whatever that means. Okay? And so none of these are particularly satisfying right now, and I think we need a common rule set that essentially captures all kinds of gameplay that we like and rejects all kinds of gameplay that we don't like. And we need to somehow agree on it. And here, I mean we in the sense of the community. And what that means is totally up to you. You can consider it the English-speaking community, which maybe consists of, I don't know, Reddit, the Paradox forums, various popular Discord servers. If you want, you can consider the community in the sense of whatever small circle of friends that you have in EU4. It really depends, right? But in my mind, I'm sort of thinking very broadly, where community really means like every single EU4 player that are interested in communicating with other EU4 players. Okay, so how do we do this? In EU4, as I mentioned, there really is no way that people do this currently. And so I want to take inspiration from other fields of study to see what they do. For example, we'll take a look at logic, which admittedly is a less serious field than EU4, but I think there's still a lot to learn from them. And in logic, the way in which people successfully communicate is that they agree on a core set of rules or axioms. And all kinds of proofs are sort of implicitly assumes a common framework of logic. Now, I'm not saying this is all that happens in logic. There's a lot of logic that talks about essentially what's called meta-logic, or proof theory, where the intuition is that you might disagree on certain core rules and talk about advantages of a particular set of rules versus another, and so on. But for example, I think modus ponens, which just talks about material implication. If A implies B and A, then B. That is to say, if I prove something like, if, I don't know, if the sky is blue, then, sorry, if x and y are even, x plus y is also even. The idea that if you add two even numbers, it remains even. So that's the if part. Now, if I know two numbers that are even, x and y, I can apply this if statement, right, by substituting particular instantiations of even numbers, say 2 and 4, to conclude that their sum, 6, is even. That's the idea of modus ponens. There's the principal explosion, which says that essentially, if I reach a contradiction, if I somehow conclude that something A is true and not A is also true, then that gives a sort of explosion where I can prove that anything is true. There's also the law of the excluded middle, which says that either A is true or not A is true. So these are like common things that we believe that are true, and we just universally, well, maybe not universally, but we tend to just agree that this is true and requires no evidence. In fact, there's really no way to give evidence to these kinds of things. You just got to start with certain assumptions. Okay? But the important point is that these assumptions are somehow minimal, okay, in the sense that they're not particularly complicated, and the set of rules you have tend to be relatively small. So I'll come back to that. And let's look at another lesser field, math. They also have a core set of rules and axioms that are self-evident, in quotes. In particular, we tend to start with set theory, with a vanilla notion of logic. To that, we add ZF axioms. Okay, and then some people add the C, the choice axiom, but that's a bit more controversial. And I suppose, given my background, I should also mention that there are minorities who use a brand of calculus, lambda calculus, and type theory as their core set of rules and axioms. Okay? So the conclusion is that these kinds of systems are what's called inductively constructed, but that doesn't need to, we don't need to use fancy words. Let's think about it in terms of chess, which I expect most of my audience is loosely familiar with, rather. So think about axioms as your starting board states. Now, in like standard chess, there's exactly one starting state, right? It's the state where you have a row of pawns and then a row of what, like castle, knight, bishop. Is it queen and then king, or king and queen, or something like that? So you have like these two rows and you have it on both sides, right? So you have one starting state or one axiom. But certainly you can imagine brands of chess. For example, chess where there's a perceived gap in skill. One might compensate for that by making one of the players start with fewer pieces on the board, or start with just less advantageous positioning. So those are your axioms, your starting states. And your rules are essentially local rules that can be applied to some arbitrary board state. Well, not arbitrary, the rules somehow restrict what kind of states that you can apply to. But for example, think about a pawn. One way to sort of formulate their movement is through a collection of rules, and one of the rules might say something like, if there is no piece in front of it, and I suppose if there's a free space in front of it, then a pawn can move to that space. It can move up one, is essentially what it's trying to say. And essentially the intuition is that the set of all possible board states that you can generate from your starting states and applying any legal moves, the rules, corresponds to, in logic, all derivable truths. So Hilbert, for example, is known to make the analogy of logic and being a game, essentially just a consequence of following rules from starting states. Okay. So here it seems like my slides bugged out. But the question I want to present is the following. Can we give an inductive construction, so like this chessboard-like version, of the set of all pure EU4 gameplay, for whatever that means? Well, that's kind of hard, because EU4 is a very complex game. So you'd have to model what even an EU4 state is. And then you'd have to describe a list of all possible rules that are somehow legal. Okay. And so I'd like to present a different approach. But before that, I'd like to sort of exaggerate the laundry list approach that I mentioned previously, apply it to chess, and sort of criticize it. So here's the idea. You allow all possible board states as a start. So, for example, you allow a board state that consists of an empty board. Now, you know that an empty board just cannot happen by following the rules of chess, right? There's going to be at least one piece, or two pieces probably, right? Before we reach an end. Another example might be a board that's filled with pawns, white pawns or something. And you know that's impossible. You know there are only a certain number of pawns that can ever exist on the board. But in this approach, we're going to just allow everything. We're going to make an over-approximation of all possible board states. And then we're going to give a list of illegal board states. For example, I might say a board that has no pieces is bad. So I use this list to kind of prune this overestimation that I give initially. And the problem with this is that it's very hard to just exhaustively list all illegal board states, right? That's just extremely long. And the other problem with this is that it's not quite clear for the person playing EU4 to know that they've gotten into this illegal board state, just because there are just going to be so many in the list, presumably. Okay, so I like to present what I consider what I call a coinductive approach. Okay, and here the idea is the laundry list, except slightly better. Here's the idea. We still start with all possible board states. In EU4, this is all possible EU4 gameplay. Actually, technically, this all in quotes doesn't have to be literally all. Okay, it just has to be an over-approximation of all the legal ones. That's to say, it should at least contain all the things, and you're okay with also containing bad things. For example, you can, in the chess case, you can easily just count the number of pieces that should exist as a maximum and immediately prune off all boards that have more than those pieces, more than that amount of pieces. That's like a quick metric that one can add, right? Alternatively, one could add that as a rule, but essentially, I want to, instead of giving a list of things that are illegal board states, I want to give a list of rules that identify illegal board states. So the idea is that this should be a bit more compact than just giving an exhaustive list of illegal board states. All right. And so going back to EU4, what makes good rules? So I've identified 4 criteria. One is self-evidence. The intuition is that the rule captures or aligns with the expectations of the community. Okay. There's orthogonality, which is not a property of a rule. It's a property of a rule with respect to its collection. But essentially, no 2 rules should say the same thing. We don't want redundancy. Okay. There should be a generality condition. The rule should be as general as possible, because again, we want to make the set of rules compact. And also, typically, generality tends to help with self-evidence. For example, go to logic. It would be kind of weird if I had a rule that says the sky is not orange, just as a rule. That seems a bit weird, right? And the reason it's weird is because it's very specific. It seems like there should be a more general rule that allows us to conclude that same thing. And I apply that for EU4 as well. And finally, there's practicality, which I care slightly less about because it's not as interesting to me, but it really should be something we care about. And practicality is essentially whatever rules allow you to prune or identify certain bad gameplay behavior should be easy to identify during gameplay. There shouldn't be a complex rule that requires the player to do a lot of math to figure out if they're violating that rule. And similarly, that rule should be like pretty easy to avoid. There should be no rule that says something like, I don't know, have nobody declare wars for 20 years consecutively, because that requires the player to somehow prevent all AIs from declaring wars, which seems impractical. So, how do we derive good rules in practice? And I'll give you one example. Let's take the fast HA revokes. Oftentimes, people consider that exploits. And I think that's a pretty fair conclusion. But the problem is that it's not very satisfying to say this particular fast revoke strategy is an exploit. So let's take a look at the so-called lambda revoke, which I reference because it's fairly easy to sort of compartmentalize and explain. So there are 3 sort of key aspects or enablers of this revoke. First, oh, and I should also mention this is already patched. But first, joining the HRE gives 5 imperial authority, so that's relevant for passing imperial reforms. 2, you can join the HRE without actually joining the HRE, rather. And 3, there are certain lists of actions you can do after you click the join HRE to be able to click join HRE again. So the key idea is that you keep clicking the join HRE button, which gives 5 imperial authority. You loop that and you farm imperial authority. That's essentially the key idea behind the fast HRE revoke, lambda revoke, sorry. So I'll give you some candidate rules to sort of identify this as a bad gameplay behavior. This is the laundry list, the current state of affairs, where people just say, oh, no lambda revoke. Like, I just disallow that. Okay, technically that is a rule, right? But it doesn't seem very satisfying. And why is that? Well, for one, it doesn't seem very general. It lacks generality. Oops, there's some background noise. Next, it doesn't seem very self-evident to me. And the reason I say that is because it seems extremely arbitrary to disallow this strategy just based on its name. What I think is that there's something that actually happens here, something more fundamental that happens here, that makes us feel like this is bad gameplay. Here's another rule. Maybe you say you can't benefit from the 5 imperial authority from joining the HRE. Okay. Now, again, this seems a tad arbitrary, which, again, traces back to generality. But the other criticism to this rule is that it's not very practical. Because to say you cannot benefit from 5 imperial authority, you can kind of interpret two ways. One way is you can never gain 5 imperial authority through joining the HRE. That's to say, players can never click join HRE, nor players should ensure that AIs never click it. So that's not very practical, right? The other interpretation is that when you say cannot benefit, maybe like you have to like mentally make a note of how much imperial authority you've gained illicitly and somehow correct for that. But again, that's not very practical because it requires the player to keep track of how much imperial authority they've gotten through someone joining the HRE and like doing some mental math. So that's also not a very good rule. Okay, now we can try to attack condition 2. Maybe you can't click the join HRE button when you cannot join the HRE. This is actually a pretty reasonable rule, I think. It seems self-evident that you should not click a button when that button, essentially, the effects of that button sort of contradicts what the button says it does. Maybe you can attack it on a generality basis, like this seems awfully specific, you're just talking about one button. So you say, okay, let's try to generalize it and say you cannot click any button when the effects of that button isn't as advertised. But the problem is that there are many buttons where what is advertised is not very obvious. For the join HRE part, there's like a very well-defined notion of what it means to join the HRE, which is your capital province is in the HRE. But there are many buttons where that's not the case, so you can't seem to generalize it. So this seems like, for now, the most general form of this flavor of rule. But I think the biggest criticism to this is, again, practicality. The player has to be aware of when they can actually join the HRE when they click that button. And before they click that button, they have to make sure that they have to go through the process, run the algorithm in their head to ensure that they're actually going to be able to join when they click. Okay, and the other thing you can do is you can try to attack the can do certain things part, condition 3. So let me elaborate on that. The key trick is that if you add an HRE province to a TC trade company, it removes it from the HRE. And there's a side note. The game actually prevents you from adding HRE provinces to trade company using the province UI, but they overlooked that you can do it through the trade UI. Well, I think that they overlooked that you can do that through the trade UI. So if you add it to TC through the trade UI, you can actually remove provinces from the HRE, and that's the key trick. So here's a candidate rule. Do not add provinces to TC. Well, that seems to solve the problem, but that does not seem to align with player expectations. We seem to believe that being able to add provinces to trade company is like self-evident, at least in certain conditions. So you can't just flat out prevent that. Okay, so you might say, do not add HRE provinces to TC. This seems like a reasonable rule, and the reason why I say it's reasonable, or maybe even self-evident, is that the province UI prevents you from doing that, essentially. But this does not seem too general, so let's try to generalize this. When two actions that are advertised to do the same thing, so in this case, adding something to TC through the UI, the province UI, and through the trade UI, okay, when they're advertised to do the same thing, but they behave differently, we should, and here's some options, follow the most conservative interpretation. That is to say, we should follow the interpretation that is the most restrictive. And in this case, the most restrictive is the province UI that tells us that you cannot add provinces to the HRE, to TC when it's already in the HRE. Another maybe reasonable interpretation is we should follow the implementation, the action that appeared the oldest in terms of game versions. And adding provinces to TC through the trade UI is a newer thing, I think. I'm actually not sure now that I think about it, but let's say it is. Then this might be another reasonable rule, and it seems to kind of scale, right? And the other possible interpretation is we follow the most fine-grained action. And actually here, then we have to actually be a bit careful with what I mean when I look at two actions that are advertised to the same thing. We should actually restrict it to say when two actions that do the same thing but operate on a different set of objects, maybe. One acts on a province, the other, the trade UI, acts on a list of provinces within a trade node. This kind of classification is actually fairly general. For example, there's the core button for individual provinces versus core button for states. And finally, there's a core all button for everything, essentially. So EU4 does seem to have this kind of style where a lot of actions are separate that do the same thing, are separated because they target different groups of things. Then maybe we should trust the most fine-grained version. So usually what the province says. Okay? So again, I'm not saying any of these rules are better than the other. In fact, I'm not even sure if this seemingly general rule has unintended consequences. Like maybe it prevents some kind of action that is something that we tend to believe is fine or normal gameplay. I actually don't know that. Let me know if you think you have counterexamples. But we can conceivably add this as a rule, and it seems far more general and far more self-evident, in my opinion, than just outright saying, do not do lambda revoke. Okay. So I would like to give you more examples, but I've run out of time and effort to make slides. So essentially, my idea is let's start with the most general interpretation of what a good gameplay is. And then we'll add a lot of rules that prune undesired kinds of gameplay. And these rules should satisfy all the conditions that I talked about. Okay, and that. Just in case, you haven't gotten the message, read the subtitle at the bottom right.